Hi, and welcome to a special World War II episode of Ins Division. I'm Glenn Reynolds. Well, Jack McCall is an attorney. He's a former regular Army officer and the author of Pogie Bates War and, most recently, Pacific Time on Target, out from Kent State University Press, and also a first-person history of World War II. Not your first person, actually, but that's part of what's the story. So your last book was a history of your father's time in World War II. How did you come to do this book?
Okay. Well, the story basically relates directly to my father's experience. My father was a Marine enlisted man with a battalion that started off on Guadalcanal in 1943. And one of his officers was a Lieutenant Christopher Donner. So as I did research about my father's life, several of the surviving Marine veterans of that unit, the 9th Defense Battalion, said you need to get in contact with Professor Donner, who had become a university professor and also a teacher and had written in 1946, only a matter of months after World War II, his own memoirs, which are, what we now have in the form of this book.
That's very interesting. And now he was a trained historian, and he was also considerably older.
Correct. And that's a fascinating story. He was 29 years old at the time of Pearl Harbor, a man who is very close to getting his PhD from Stanford. His wife was about 3 weeks off from having birth of their only son. Yet, nevertheless, when World War II began for the for the United States with Pearl Harbor, he was motivated enough that he said, "I need to do something about it." So, at almost being 30 years old, he nevertheless joined the Marine Corps. Said, "I want to become an officer." Went through officer candidate school, and that led to this experience in the Pacific.
And he found officer candidate school pretty rough, didn't he?
He did.
Was that partly because he was older, or just because it was rough?
I think a combination of the two, Glenn. I mean, part of it was, obviously he's now close to 30 years old still when he goes through officer candidate school. But, having been through the life of an educated and fairly sophisticated person to go into the nitty-gritty of officer candidate school, which is every bit as tough now, if not tougher than it was then, had to have been a challenging experience for a man like him.
Now, it's very different because, for people of the Vietnam generation, the story is always about trying to get out of combat or get out of serving altogether. Right. And yet here's a guy who volunteered, and he actually tells a story in the book of somebody who actually tried to stow away on the troop ship and head out to combat in the Pacific when he didn't have to. Well, what's that about?
Well, it's maybe the same motivation that happened with Chris himself. You have people who have seen our country go through one of the most horrifying times in its experience with the attack on Pearl Harbor. People truly felt scared and understood the United States was, at stake in a way that we very seldom have seen in our history. So that had been a motivating factor. But, besides it being a different time and a different war, one can also conclude there was something about the nature of Marine Corps training, maybe that bonding, maybe that roughness of officer candidate school in boot camp was such that people really felt like they had to take care of their buddies, and it would be really difficult to leave your buddies in the lurch.
I guess so. It's really pretty interesting that happened. Now, on Okinawa, which is one of the places where Donner was, of course, the fighting was very fierce and really some of the worst stuff of the war. And he got kind of a window into a very unusual event. He actually saw General Buckner a couple of days before Buckner was killed, and that's the last U.S. general to be killed in combat. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. General Simon Bolivar Buckner was the commander of the U.S. Army and Marine forces in Okinawa. He was very much a upfront kind of leader. He was not a guy who believed in leading from his headquarters at all, and literally only a matter of days before he was killed by a Japanese bombardment, Chris Donner, who's an artillery forward observer, is up front with the infantry observing Japanese positions, and all of a sudden this figure appears behind him, and it's none other than 3-star General Buckner.
You don't have that kind of thing happen very often anymore.
Not very often, no, that's
I guess it didn't happen that often back then. Well, Donner was a forward observer, and explain to viewers who might not know what that is. That's pretty rough duty, and was especially rough duty in Okinawa,
Absolutely.
I guess.
A forward observer, to explain to our viewers, is basically a person who is an artillery officer. He is assigned to accompany infantry and other frontline soldiers as they proceed into active combat. His job is to basically carry a radio set, telephone, other types of communication equipment, and find enemy targets, make sure that the artillery behind our lines get the coordinates so they can fire accurately, and then observe the enemy positions as they come to bombardment. The life expectancy of forward observers was probably only slightly better, maybe slightly worse than that of company officers, company commanders, and radio operators. They were prime targets.
Yeah, well, for one thing, if you're the enemy troops and you're being shelled, you're going to look for the forward observer and try to put it into them, for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. They were a threat to be reckoned with, and frankly, probably one of the little-known success stories of the American military in World War II is actually the skill and technical superiority of our artillery. Both Japanese and German troops on occasion remarked that was the one thing they really dreaded. And it was due to people like Chris Donner and his forward observation team that really made the difference in that technological superiority.
I guess the Soviet strategy would be to send your worst guy out as the forward observer, right? Because you figure he's not going to last very long. So it's a different strategy to send somebody who's actually really good. Well, after the war, Donner's work wasn't over, and in fact, he was an early scuba enthusiast. Tell us some of the stuff he did with the UDTs and such.
Sure. Well, we don't know a lot about what he did with the UDT, underwater demolition teams. He was, as you mentioned, one of the first early American civilians to really get into scuba diving, and he got into it big time. He traveled the world. He went back to some South Pacific islands. He was a writer for Skin Diver magazine, and he continued to do it well up into his later life. We have reason to think that at some point in time in the 60s, he may have helped either Navy or Marine underwater demolition teams do some sneaky work, but he never discussed that with his family. In fact, his son to this day says that's probably the less we know about it, maybe the safer the family is, but that's kind of an inside joke.
Maybe I shouldn't have asked.
Oh, I don't think so.
So you call him the thinking man's James Bond?
Exactly. And that's the thing that's interesting, is that that's a line that his son came to think about. He's come across with James Bond, and the fact he's a little bit of inventive. In the islands, he amuses himself with, perfecting different types of things. He's also the way of thinking man John Dwayne, too, and that's the way that his son likes to think about him, in as much as that he is a person who's extremely intelligent. He obviously was skilled in several languages. He's very well trained as a historian. He was later in life a philanthropist. He helped develop several schools in Philadelphia and in Florida, but also a man of action. He really liked action. He really liked adventure. He really liked to travel.
Now, this sort of thing, the sort of academic in the military, we saw a lot of that in World War II. Right. You still have some of that today. I mean, I guess that Austin Bay, who's also a PJ person, is an example of that, but not nearly as much. Was there something different about the time, or was it just something different about the war?
I think it may have been a little bit of both, but probably, again, the nature of the war. Perhaps the fact that you had the United States under attack in a very direct way that, again, we had, heretofore not seen since the War of 1812. Of course, we've experienced something more recently like that with 9/11. But at a time, you had a lot more solidity, a lot more unification, I think, among American people in terms of their will and dedication to do something about the threat that America faced. And academics obviously were not immune to that. He did his part by going to the military. Others did their part by joining in forces and supporting the Manhattan Project and other technological efforts, but he just chose to be an academic and do it perhaps in a slightly more direct route.
Now, one of the things that struck me at the end of the book is how relieved everybody was after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that really resonates with a family story, because my grandfather landed at Normandy, walked all the way across Europe to the end of the European War, and then, in reward for his service, was packed onto a troop ship and sent to the Pacific, where he was going to be part of the invasion of Japan, where they expected to be like 1 million casualties. Right. And he was also extremely relieved when the atomic bombs went off in Japan and the war was over. Do you think people were right to feel that way?
Well, I'll put it this way. Chris Donner and all of his friends owned the aircraft carrier USS Card, who were coming back to the United States having spent years in the Pacific Theater, were ecstatically delighted when they heard about Hiroshima. They said, now we know we're going to live. My father had exactly the same response. He was going through training in California. And he said, we kissed the ground, we jumped up and down, we yelled and screamed. And again, his remark was, we knew we were going to live. When I was younger at one point, and I was talking to him about, how obviously nuclear weapons had been a terror that had been hanging over our head ever since, his response was to just look at me and say, son, you don't know what you're talking about. Had I been in the invasion of Japan, you wouldn't be here, your sister wouldn't be here, and I most certainly wouldn't be here. And, from a person who's had the perspective of being a combat infantryman, a combat artilleryman, Marine, whatever, these were guys who were absolutely convinced that if an invasion of Japan had gone on in the fall of 1945, vast numbers of them would have died. And also vast number of Japanese civilians, too, we need to point out.
And, it's funny because we're coming up on the anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. And a couple of years ago, John Stewart called Harry Truman a war criminal for dropping those bombs. And our own Bill Whittle recorded a memorable rant on PJTV. And we've got just a short clip of it here if you want to see what you think.
Sure.
Jon Stewart wants to call Harry Truman a war criminal? If Harry Truman is a war criminal for the atomic bombings, then Roosevelt is one for the fire bombings of Tokyo and Dresden. And if Roosevelt is a war criminal for causing the fiery deaths of civilians, then Abraham Lincoln, whose Union armies burned Atlanta and Columbia to the ground in order to end that war, well, he must be one too.
What do you think?
Well, I'll put it this way. Again, based on the experience of numerous American survivors and veterans of that war, obviously many of them are dead and many more are dying on a daily basis. I think a lot of them would absolutely agree with Bill's commentary. You know, for them, these were people who said, you know, this was the moment of life and death in an extremely literal way. And it also, I think, again, bears repeating to note that many Japanese would have died as well. You know, while one can say that clearly it was a terrible thing for you know, Nagasaki and Hiroshima to be the first and only cities that have been the victims of an atomic attack, at the same point in time, who knows what would have happened if Operation Coronet, the invasion of Kyushu, would have gone through in 1945 and 1946. It would have been horrendous. It is very hard to say at the end of the day that, you know, the way history would have worked out differently.
Yeah, I think that would probably have been one of the worst things to ever happen in the history of the world. Had it gone
would have
forward.
been horrendous.
Well, I certainly agree. Well, that's Jack McCall. He's an attorney, a former regular Army officer, and the author of Pogie Bates War and, most recently, Pacific Time on Target, which is out from Kent State University Press and available on Amazon and at the finer bookstores everywhere. Thanks for hanging out with us, Nick.
Thank you very much. Glad to join you all today.
And thanks to all of you for joining us, too. We'll be back next week. And in the meantime, have fun on the internet. Thanks.